everyone, welcome to the first talk of the semester that we're organizing as BULING. We're happy to see that so many of you are interested in today's talk, as it is a very relevant subject of interest both in Turkey and around the world. We have Metin Hoca with us today, a faculty member from our Linguistics department, and some of you may already be familiar with him from our lectures. So he has studied the morphosyntactic structures of several endangered languages spoken in and around Turkey. And without further ado, I would like to leave the stage for Dr. Metin Bağrıaçık. Enjoy.
Aha. Okay. Hey.
Hocam kayıt için bu.
Kayıt için bu.
Evet. Ben onu açayım mı burada?
Nereye takayım? Buraya mı takayım?
Evet.
Okay. Great. Now I think you can hear me. Without this, that doesn't work. Okay, I can use it. It's really okay. So I'm really impressed to see many of you at this hour of the week here, and thank you so much. I'm really flattered for this, and also I thank BULING and these fantastic people behind it for organizing this series of lectures. Yeah, without really getting too much into this, I should start with my presentation. So what I'm going to be talking about is going to be some trivial piece of information, which from a non-expert in the area, which you would probably figure out yourself even just lying on the bed. But I hope eventually you will find at least one piece among these important, informative, or even provocative at the end of the course. So I will try to talk about the language crisis that we have. And apparently this language crisis refers to the loss of languages that we have around. But to be able to talk about the loss, we should first start with the presence of something, right? And about the presence, we all know, or at least appreciate, that we live in a globe, in a world of thrilling diversity. Diversity in ecological niches, diversity in fauna or flora, and also the languages, obviously. So probably you have all known, you have all heard about the fact that there are more than 7,000 languages. Languages as defined a non-dialect of something listed in Ethnologue. I just gathered a couple of numbers for this. In 2023, it was like 68, just reduced to 7,164. But the reduction is really minimal, right? I mean, it's just 4. What's a big deal in that? The issue is when you zoom into these numbers a bit more, that we see that something is really not right. And here are the numbers again that I gathered from 2023 and 2024. And these refer to the number of L1 speakers, like the mother language, like number of the people who speak some languages as their mother tongue. So there is this question mark for which we are really unclear whether they are still out there or not. Yet we have heard from one linguist here or one field worker out there that they heard that there is some language in the Amazonian basin or in Papua New Guinea, and probably they had some language speakers, but we are clearly unsure of them. Just leave them aside. And then there is this thrilling factor that the number of the speakers is less than 10. And there we have like 117 in 2023, which reduced to 2011. What's happening to them? Or those languages which are being spoken, or at least was spoken by the time these data was gathered, which have less than 100, in 2024 we have 304. And those which have less than 1,000, there it goes more than 1,000. So when you combine all of them, we end up with a thrilling number of 1,700 odd number of languages, that different species, different entities that are spoken by less than 1,000 people across the globe. Now, what does that even mean? That doesn't really mean a lot by sheer numbers, but when you compare it to the global number of languages, that make almost 1/4, which is great. And even more, think about how many people we are on this globe, and all these languages add up to some rough 400,000 speakers. And that's it. That's less than probably Kadıköy. That you can squeeze everyone or all these 1,700 languages in one little area, basically. But again, numbers don't mean anything in isolation, right? Because a speaker population of 1,000 or less in an underdeveloped portion of the globe, where they're relatively secure, is an entirely different reality of the world than 1,000 speaker in Istanbul or somewhere in the US or somewhere in China. So these entities should be separated. So sheer numbers don't mean anything. Think about the Hadza population in Tanzania. From the first moment on, when the Westerners, when the colonizers had a contact with them, that makes at the end of the 19th century, their population is stable, fluctuating between 1,200 and 1,300. And it's very, very vivid. It's not listed as one of the vulnerable languages of the world. It's perfectly okay. There is nothing wrong with it. So by looking at sheer numbers, of course, you can catch the attention of the public, but by looking at them only, it doesn't really make sense. So then you have to zoom in even more. Because we can't just say for all these people to say that, okay, you have to be larger in number. It doesn't really make sense. To be able to do this zooming in, we can rely on certain scales. One of them is this expanded graded disruption scale, which takes into consideration a lot of different factors to see whether really we're losing something or not. And they have these more intricate categorization of the languages, of all these 7,000 odd languages into one or the other thing. So over here, let's say the levels, the categories 1 and 6A, we're totally okay. You can say that there is no problem for them, right? And then that adds up to almost 4,000 languages. Whew, it's great. But then we end up with 6B, which is called threatened languages, which essentially talks about those languages, characterizes those languages where we have an extremely rapid loss of L1 learners. And that's the crucial part of losing or saving a language. Hence the red light over here. Then you can go to the shifting, where essentially the transmission, the generational transmission to kids, to newborns, is completely gone. And then you can go to the moribund ones, where you only have grandpas, which I'm sure many of you are familiar, even from your own dialects, right? And I'm not even talking about these dialects yet. And then there was nearly extinct ones. Yeah, those are the grandparents or the older generation necessarily, but who really do not have any more chance to talk about them, talk in or about the language anymore. And then of course the dormant ones, which have only symbolic proficiency, 1 or 2 speakers, essentially any single Native American language you can clearly put in category 9. And then the problem is when you compare these two. But before, of course, this intricate thing takes into consideration a lot of factors, obviously, right? So first, what about the ethnic population who claim that they were, or at least they belong to this speaker community historically, and what is their relation to the speaker population? And what about the stability index of this population? You have to take into consideration. Are there any migration patterns, at least in the last 100 years, among the population? And how about the use scale of L2? What L2 is more widely used and in what domains, basically. So technically, by taking all these factors into consideration, it's better to categorize these languages into one or the other, rather than just looking at how many people speak them or not. But then, the question is, even when we take these into consideration, we end up in some information which really doesn't make sense at all. Think about the lost speakers. Now they say that the number of lost speakers range between 45,000 to 500,000. What type of range is this, for the love of God? I mean, it's essentially the same thing as saying nothing. So the problem is, and hence the first thing that I want to really emphasize, we have no information for almost all these 3,000 odd languages, and everything we say is purely impressionistic, unfortunately. They may be okay, which I doubt. But unfortunately, given the current information we have, whatever we say is purely impressionistic for many of the languages. Even with this impression that we have, one thing is clear, that almost half of those languages is in facing a serious problem ahead. And what problem is that? Well, the problem is essentially, if you ask my opinion, that red light. The moment you're losing kids, you're losing it. You can be 1,000, 100,000 speakers, like Kurdish over there. But the moment you are rapidly losing L1 learners, that means that you have to be threatened, or you're facing. It cannot be, maybe it's in the remote past, the remote future, but you are going to eventually face the problem that many of these moribund languages have faced at one point in their life. So clearly, where did this 62 go when you compare them with the numbers in 2023? Just 2 days ago, I came across an entirely randomly a piece of information, piece of news on the what was it, Science Direct? I think so, which said that some field workers went to Papua New Guinea just to see what the ecology and everything is, and only to find that 2 speakers that they knew that they met in 2006 were all gone, which they just labeled it extinct, basically. It's okay, it's gone. So every language that is gone is irreversible. You can't bring it back, unless, of course, we will see. So when you look at the numbers, there are a lot of codes that we can rely on. First, the last speaker of probably half of the world's languages are alive today. And once they're gone, they're gone. And about 85% of the living languages, they say, it was garden in 2010, by 2150. If nothing changes over here, if the same rate happens to continue. And the same thing, a bit more gloomy, talks about 90% of the languages are going to face it. And that's what I meant by it doesn't matter whether you are 10,000 or 100,000 people at this moment. The moment you left that red line, you are doomed to fail. Now, of course, by sheer numbers, and most of you are linguists, or at least people who are interested in languages, already are alarmed, and you have already been alarmed for the just general public. So there is something more alarming and this becomes clear when we make the simile, the thing like languages as species. So these are the numbers that I gathered from USN, like International Union for Conservation of Nature. And they list in 2004 that among all the marine fishes, 4% of them are seriously threatened, which essentially have the same projections as the languages, basically. By the turn of the 21st century, they're going to be disappearing completely. And the number becomes worse when you go to birds, reptiles, mammals, and then the coniferous plants, and then the sharks and rays and chimerians, and the amphibians. Amphibians at the end of the spectrum. And that's very alarming, right? So everyone really wants to protect nature. But think about the languages. It's 44% of them. So what it means is that the percentage of the threatened languages is worse than the worst within the animal kingdom, the amphibians. Fantastic. And the thing is, nowhere is it safe. These are the languages plotted on the globe, which are essentially categorized as 6B and below. And as you see, there is no place that is safe completely. Then the question is, should we really mourn the loss of Ayak or Öbek, Sumru Hoca, probably you know, who met the last speaker of this language, any less than the loss of Panda or the California condor? Well, many people say, no, there's no point. But to which we will come momentarily. Now, the thing is, of course, this was alarming. This language as species was very alarming, and it catches the popular attention, and of course, certainly urges people to do something, or at least seem to do something. But there's a little bit of caveat that we have to take into consideration when we make the simile. First things first, it depicts languages as entities that are in competition with each other to catch an ecological niche. No. Symbiosis is a reality of languages, has always been. What I mean by this is multilingualism. And the second thing is, the problem, when you look at from this perspective as species, language revitalization of maintenance attempts always take into consideration the empowerment of the language in and by itself. But it's not entirely true. You can't do much about a language by itself. Maintenance is essentially about the empowerment of its users, or at least its potential users, not necessarily the language itself. And once you are talking about the speakers and not necessarily about the language, bigger problems emerge. And in other words, the simile is mine. Think about a fish oil, which essentially, I don't know if you have taken, in my childhood it was really like they were pushing fish oil capsules. But recent research shows that fish oil doesn't really mean anything in a capsule. In other words, you don't need fish oil, you need oily fish to be healthy. And then the moment you take out this fish out of its own context, out of its own ecology, you can't do much about with it, just like you can't do much about the language when you don't consider its speaker community and its pure ecology. Okay, so this is the global take-up. The first, we need L1 learners. The moment you're losing them, the death is just around the corner. And the second thing, you have to talk about speaker empowerment. And the third thing, which is also very important, is that the individuality of the problems. Every single language, just like those which do not necessarily face the threat, those that face the threat of extinction are a sui generis problem by itself, which is essentially made up of very many interrelated factors, clearly historical, cultural, and political. What does that mean? That means that no one has a magical wand to do one for all thing for every language. It's not going to work. So all these things like Türkiye'de tehlike altında olan diller için ne yapılabilir? The question is too general to ask. It's too big. You have to go to microscopic level, to which I will come at the end. Now, our problems are individual, but I'm sure you would already think about themselves, but our reasons are very global to at least save or pretend to save these languages as human beings. I could talk about three angles to be able to talk about this urge or wish to conserve or maintain or revitalize these languages. First things first, our ethical reasons, the most subjective one. But I think that's enough. Think about this. Just like human beings are the sole responsible entities of the Holocene extinction, so are they responsible for the whole extinction of these 3,000 odd languages. You have to accept this. It can be either by open discrimination over the minorities, over some other speaker population, or sneaky social pressure, which becomes ultimately self-inflicting. But we are the self-responsible of this. And just like many people feel responsible for conserving the nature, especially in the West now, so you have to feel responsible for this, just for the sake of righting the wrong of the past. And that simple reasoning, the ethical reason, which you may or you may not, depending on where you stay in the ethical continuum, you have to buy it. And that's enough. Now, of course, this type of ethical reasoning, I hope we all share, but this is not universal, unfortunately. I don't know if you have ever come across anyone who really told you, so what if a language or two dies? What's the problem? One type of speakers talk about the fact that most of them are not capable anyways. They are simply short of functioning. So we had this idea, a couple of years ago, we were having this field work, and we asked how you could thank in Romaica, a language that's spoken in Trabzon. And she said, we cannot even thank in Romaica. There is no word for thanking. Or many other things, right? They can't count more than 5. They have to switch to Turkish. Right? So, of course, this was funny back then, but there is an established self-respect or lack of self-respect or respect for the language in such sentences. They themselves consider it not enough. what is it to be a language, to be enough? Because we know, of course, as linguistic students, that there is no such language which has no power to explain anything, right? So essentially, this is not about the capacity of the languages by themselves. So anyone, if they say that, but this language and that language is not fit for writing, or that is not fit for reading and physics and whatsoever, says, I'm sorry, bullshit. Because you can do one thing with language and provide it the capacity, the so-called capacity, but this has nothing intrinsic into languages. Just like in free market economy, it's about branding and advertising. English is English, unlike Dutch or German, in which you could do the same things simply because it was in the right place, in the right time. I mean, which was wrong for the rest of the globe, right? And that is the marketing. It's branding, right? So, in a sense, Romeka doesn't necessarily like anything. They can thank in Turkish, nobody cares, right? You can thank in English as well, using French words, merci. That's not a problem. But the problem is to increase this self-respect within the community. So, a better answer to give... Öyle mi? Okay, sorry. So, the better answer to give such people who are challenging our global ethical reasons is that there is no such language which cannot do whatever you can do in English or in French. Simply, you didn't give the people the chance. Fair enough. And then the second type of criticism to our ethical subjective reason can be derived from historical facts, right? So we were talking about 7,000 odd languages, half of which more or less were in the verge of extinction, but that's still the tip of the iceberg, right? Everything dies. Nothing is tapandare, everything moves. Because if you just make a rough estimation, rough calculation since the behavioral modernity, that is the Great Leap Forward, that's the cognitive revolution, you could say, which happened around 50,000 before present, and just make a calculation of for every 1,000 years, there were roughly around 6,000 languages here and there that you can call as languages, then this adds up, extracting the ones that are still alive today, more than 200,000 languages, which disappeared, right? So, where did they go all? So many people would think that, okay, death is inevitable. Why is the fuss? Well, now we have to discover the difference between death and abandonment, right? Truly, languages die, like Latin or Old Turkic, but evolving into something else, right? So there is, in many places, there is this continuity to begin with. But for many languages that show the rapid extinction the last 100 years, there's no such thing. You can call them abandonment. And even the very fact that Alexander the Great is responsible for hundreds of languages from Bactria to Thrace doesn't necessarily mean that this is natural to be accepted. It just strengthens our ethical reasoning that righting the wrong of the past, just to stand in the right perspective of the ethical continuum. And another question that you can ask at this point is that, but why is it language A, say, Romeka, that dies and not Turkish? Why is it ethical? Why is it okay for Romeka to die but not Turkish or anything else? Right? Why would they die? You could just say it's natural. They have fewer speakers, it's not capacity, and like, but this natural word, which creates hatred in this very context, is just a word to camouflage the power play between the societies. There is nothing natural in this. There is a lot of oppression, there is a lot of looking down upon, and that's it. Perhaps the most peaceful death is the one that comes bottom up. That when the community gives away the language themselves, just at the point when they can truly discover that they can continue their culture with some other means. One of them is, I think one of the best examples is the Greek population, which probably you know, the Karamanlılar, right? So they stopped talking Greek long ago. But both the religion and the local culture probably was enough for them to not make a fuss about the language. There was no talk of language within the community at all, neither before or nor after the exchange of populations. Because the identity, the being as Karamanlı was enough for them. So maybe there is a peaceful death, but the death should be the choice of the people, not necessarily the one that is inflicted on them. Okay, so I think the ethical reasons and their answers are great. And also the last question, even at the peaceful death part, why should we settle for death anyways when there is such a beautiful atmosphere of multilingualism that potentially is possible? Well, the next reasoning that we can talk about is, our next set of reasons are purely aesthetic, just for the sake of diversity, right? Now, of course, I have put a caveat for the simile between the species extinction and the language extinction, but here it comes appropriate to talk about them. Think about the species. One species probably doesn't count, but it is a part of an entire ecosystem. So its importance comes because it's a part of a fantastically big, which is hard to conceive by a single individual system. You could make the same argument for the languages themselves. Think about the cross-fertilization of thoughts between language communities. How much importance how much encoding of history, their local ethnoculture, their local ecosystem is encoded in one language. So the moment you are depriving the speakers of themselves or they inflict it to themselves, you lose a lot. I'm not going to give any counter-arguments to this because I don't think there should be any. The third one is the utilitarian ones, the more rational ones. Because here, the language is not language by itself. It's in fact, a speaker empowerment all by itself. The value of a language, as Grenoble and Wales says, is not necessarily its communicative power, but it is also the sense of the belonging it creates. Just like other parts of culture, the language by itself creates a belonging, the identity. And no one can deny at this very point, although our evidence is very scarce and still doubtful, people started to ask the right question, the question between talking in L1, the ancestral language, and the mental and societal well-being. Now, there are quite a lot of studies out there which found some correlations. Of course, I have to emphasize that correlation is not causation, but you can find a direct or indirect link between using your indigenous ancestral language and your mental well-being. Here, some people, the effect of home language use on the mental health have been found to influence the youth suicide in British Columbia. The rate of the youth suicide in British Columbia is significantly lower among those people who can speak their ancestral language than those who can't. Or in Alberta, it's related to the lower levels of diabetes. Or somewhere in Labrador, it shows like the speakers, people who can speak their ancestral language shows much higher resilience measures in many tests than those who have already abandoned the ancestral language. Now, the evidence is scarce, but it is the right question to ask. There must be a link. The link may not be direct. Think about this. So the lower rates of diabetes in Alberta, it may not necessarily be that I talk Turkish and I have liver diabetes. But the indirect link probably comes from the fact that those local populations, simply by virtue of the fact that they were let to speak their own language and in fact fostered to teach it, probably also gained some socioeconomical freedom from the bigger community, that they can sustain themselves, which means that they also turn this language into economy. And once you turn it into economy, that means you feed better, right? When you have money, you can buy organic food, right? So the link might be indirect, but still, ultimately, you can link it. You can link something between a language and the society's well-being, let it be physical or mental. But of course, for these rational arguments, there is a lot of other counter arguments, obviously. So many people would think that if you really want to be in the market, you have to talk in the language of the bigger community. With a smaller one, you can't. You just simply because you can't cope. That's probably one of the biggest reasons of why we are losing Laz speakers, Romaica speakers, or many other speakers in Turkey. For the sake of many parents recite the same thing continuously so that they can study and find a better job, right? This is, of course, undeniable. Who am I to deny? I mean, if they think this is the case, let it be, because they can't do much. But where does it lead us to look at the world simply from a materialistic perspective? What type of world are we just envisaging when we do this and when we take it to the extreme? Think about the ancient Greeks. Do you really remember them because they were filthy rich? Or because of Homer, or all these scientific books, or all these philosophical texts that they have left us? Right? So, it is true that many communities abandon their languages because they want a better future. But this is, of course, not their fault. They have never been given the chance to let's say, flower in their own language ecosystem. We will come to this. And finally, of course, our utilitarian reason can be counteracted by many people, which unfortunately is also a fact, and in fact an undeniable fact of Turkey, is that whenever you talk about language, suddenly it is linked to this ethno-nationalism. Again, there is not much you can say. You can leave on the shoulders of the speaker community, right? We all know that oppression brings counter-arguments, counter-reactions, right? The more you oppress, the more they do. But as every sensible individual as we are here, and also our parents, we have to distinguish apples from oranges. I think we lost something in the Western world with the Enlightenment, that an alternative life exists and possible. We lost the alternative way of symbiosis, way of life, that pluralism, both in languages, in economy, in everything, is possible within the same ecological niche. And for that, I can't really blame any speaker community, but us, who are probably among here the people who are responsible of all these people to abandon their languages. Okay. So I think we have enough reasons to talk about their preservation. But how would you make them survive? Well, you have already seen it's almost impossible, right? And in fact, in many case after case, all these efforts show us that it is impossible. It doesn't work. Here, most language revitalization efforts to date have failed. Creating an orthography or producing TV programs with children in a local language are, of course, very important, but they won't work. It doesn't really work, clearly. Now it's time to feel small, clearly, right? But at least you can show your standpoint. The first thing, it requires, if you ask my opinion, an honest evaluation of the specific threat and how it is perceived by the community. Take it out of impression, go to the field, or at least be allowed to go to the field. Talk to the people. What do they feel about the language? You know, you can also talk about this language death for the Greek speakers of Istanbul, but there are so many speakers within the community who believe that the language should die, let it go. They don't need it. They already learned modern Greek. Why would they need the local thing? You have to give an ear to what people say. But for this, of course, individuals can't mean much. In many places, you can't even go to the field properly, securely to talk. And I have no idea how this can change. And the second thing, there is no one-size-fits-all way of doing this. Most failure comes from this very initial zero step, that we don't even know what the threat is, whether there's a threat or not. What's the size of the threat? What the community thinks about the threat itself. Once probably you have figured it out, you will just see that for some of them, maybe many of them, which we have listed to have speakers under 1,000, you don't have to do anything. Just let them be. Don't intervene for the love of God. Don't go. Don't talk. Leave them. They survive, right? Troyo, with so many genocides, so many things, the Semitic languages of Southeast. For thousands of years, they have been there, just as such. And it is very vivid. So many little kids still learn it, even in the families which are bilingual. It's fine. Just let them be. They figure it out themselves. But for many, unfortunately, many parties have to co-shoulder the responsibility. And here, again, what we can conclude is that because not many of these parties are going to really share the same ethical, aesthetic, or the utilitarian reasons as you or I have, it's going to fail. So you can't save them all. Many of them are going to die, unfortunately. This is, of course, I know this is like a doomsday thing, but this is the reality. Maybe for some of them, you can just carry a bucket of water. Of course, there is no global thing, global way of saving them, but since we cut between being threatened and not being threatened at the decreasing number of L1 speakers, your target should be increasing the number of them. And you being individuals who speak one language or the other, even your dialect, if you still keep some, or an institution like the Turkish Republic. It would work with increasing the number of Alto speakers, right? Which is one way of starting from somewhere, especially at the generation, at the childbearing generation, target them. Maybe it will work. We tried it in the middle. And it in fact increased, it also got a lot of local support, local institutional support from the church. In the end it failed, but it's okay. I did my best. So once you target them, the second thing would be, remember, the way we stand, most of those languages have speakers that are elderly. Grandparents, grandmothers. But they have to be dragged into the equation. I don't know how, but there are examples. Think about New Zealand, how they revived, at least it wasn't as much threatened, but now it's a thriving language. One of the most important things is that because they build these so-called language nests, local creche, local daycare, where elderly community members are also employed. All they had to do was read a book, play with them in Maori. And this happened in 20 years. The result was fantastic. But not by itself, obviously, because you also have to continue this. Rather than having these seçmeliler in the 7th, 8th grades, which is way too late, incorporated in early on, the 1st grade, 2 hours in Lazo, Romaica, how much money would you need? Think about how much money we spend on every bullshit. If you really wanted, it would work. I know it seems impossible because we can't think of an alternative way. But alternatives exist. Alternative systems, alternative states existed throughout the essential history. And of course, the ultimate target is the intergenerational transmission. At this point, this is great. Now you can create TV programs. It doesn't really matter. Think about ways how these elderly people or the parents who are either the second language learners or someone who knows 5, 6 sentences in this language can spend time with the young outside school. What can you do? We spend very little time on socializing in Turkey. Did you realize that? By socializing, I don't mean about going to a cafe or a bar or a cinema. Like local youth clubs. Local elderly clubs where they go and play cards and the like, apart from a cafe. Why not? People are hungry about them, where people from different generations can come together. That would work. The problem is, also ultimately you have to ask yourself this question: when would you say that you have succeeded in this, either as a community or as an institution or as an individual? There's no answer. Even if you have, in many cases, simply the first step, that having an honest evaluation of the thing without bringing the result, you may call it a success. And then you can have a documentation, but the language can die. And in many places, probably it's more ethical to let it die than trying to force people. Okay, I think that's it. I don't have much. Thank you so much. And please visit this BULING list.
We are very thankful to Metin Hoca for his lecture today. And that is it for this evening. Or is it? You can join us right there and grab a cup of coffee and munch on the snacks that we brought and have a chit-chat / Q&A session with Metin Hoca and us. We highly encourage you to join and ask questions, as there are still many questions unanswered about this topic, I think. You can scan this QR code and find all of our social media links, and as well as our feedback form that you can fill out. That is it, I think.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.